Today we're going to start our new unit on evolution, and we're going to start with chapter 22. And chapter 22 is about Darwin, basically who we call the father of evolution, what he found, how his findings shaped our evolutionary theory that the scientific community believes to be true today. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that. So, in the 1850s, Charles Darwin published his life's work called The Origin of Species and basically focused all the biologists, all the scientists' attention on the diversity of organisms all over the world. His biggest note was that he thought that current species were descendants of ancestral species or older species, and basically he coined the term descent with modification, and this is where evolution came from. Now, descent with modification means that as you are descending or going through the generations, every single generation is being modified in some way or changed. So that's where that came from. And then evolution can be viewed as a pattern as well as a process, because we can kind of guess a little bit what's going to happen based on the environment, but it's definitely a process that takes a long time, like hundreds of thousands of years. So this is just a timeline of where the ideas came from for evolution. You can take some time to look at this in your book, but I'm not going to go over this in too much detail. So there were some other scientists that kind of helped shape the theory of evolution, kind of helped shape Charles Darwin's idea. There was this guy, Linnaeus, Carolus Linnaeus, and basically he was the founder of what we call taxonomy. And all taxonomy is basically just categorizing organisms. So, our levels of taxonomy: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, all that you should have talked about last year in pre-AP or regular biology. So that is taxonomy, just categorizing plants and animals and bacteria into their different species. So there was this French scientist who also helped, named Cuvier, and he studied fossils. He was into paleontology, and why that was important is because fossils was a big part of where Darwin's ideas came from. So with the work of Cuvier and his paleontology, Darwin was able to look at these fossils and be like, hey, here are some similarities between old organisms and new. And we all know what fossils are, but in case you don't, they are old traces of organisms that lived in the past in some kind of rock or in the layer of the earth, which is called strata. So here is just some of the layers of the earth under some water, and then the different colors represent different layers of type of like sediment and dirt and stuff, and then you can see that the fossils can be in the different layers. Okay, so the newest layers are on top, and then it gets older as you go down. So another scientist at the time that was important that to mention is Lamarck. Okay, and then he had Lamarckism, which we're going to talk about. But this guy Lamarck, he guessed that species evolved through basically the use and disuse of body parts. Okay, so if you don't use it, you lose it, that kind of a thing. And then he also hypothesized that species evolved because they get acquired characteristics from using or not using these body parts. Okay, so back to Darwin. He traveled on this ship called the Beagle, and basically what his job was he was the naturalist for this ship. He studied nature. It was totally his job just to get on this boat, on this ship, and go collect fossils, look at species. He collected specimens, live specimens too, and write down notes at everywhere that the Beagle stopped. But he mostly focused his ideas from South America, plants and animals, and he also observed adaptations of the plants and animals along the many different types of environments in South America. So this is a map of the Beagle's expedition, and this guy right here is Charles Darwin. Started in Europe. They kind of sailed all over the world, but they concentrated themselves mostly in South America. And then this little piece, this little cluster of islands right here is called the Galápagos Islands. And this was probably the most important stop on his voyage because this is where he collected the infamous finches and his tortoises, and basically where he thought of his idea. So the reason that the Galapagos Islands were so important is because they had different climates. They were close together, but they definitely had different climates from each other. One was more of a grassland, another one was more of a shrubland, another one was more of a desert climate, even though they were so close together. So what he saw was that the different species actually adapted to the environments, even though they were so close together. And then he concluded that speciation happened to the Galapagos finches, and all speciation is making a new species. So you can see from these three finches here that even though they were so close together, they're similar, but they're super, super different. So this guy, letter A up here, he eats fruit from a cactus, so his beak has to be long and a little bit more narrow to get at that cactus fruit. An insect eater is going to have a sharper beak so he can get into different crevices and stuff to get out the insects and termites and stuff. And then this seed eater has a big old fat beak because it has to break open seeds. Now, they're really similar to each other, but these differences are important based on what the environment held for them on their various islands. So in 1844, Charles Darwin wrote an essay on the origin of species and then natural selection. So natural selection is a super, super important word in this chapter and in evolution in general. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But he wrote an essay on it, but he really didn't introduce his theory for a long time. Because back at the time, everyone was all super, super religious, and they just probably wouldn't accept this very well. So he thought that there would be a public uproar. So he waited on it and kind of sat on it. And then in 1858, so years later, he actually received a manuscript from this guy named Alfred Wallace. And he basically wrote about the same thing that Charles Darwin did about natural selection. So Charles Darwin was like, oh God, he's going to take my idea, he's going to get all the credit. So he hurried up and he finished his book and published it the next year, and it's called The Origin of Species. So, in The Origin of Species, in the book, in his idea, Charles Darwin wrote about two very important things. The first was descent with modification, which we talked about, okay? So as you are going through the different life cycles and different generations, you are descending through time, but you are changing. You are getting modified after every generation based on what's available in your environment. And this explains why the Earth is so diverse with different types of organisms. And then the second idea was natural selection. Okay, and this is basically evolution caused by adapting to the environment. So this is an example of descent with modification. So basically down here at the bottom, here's the oldest part of the timeline, and then here's the newest part of the timeline. We're looking at a timeline of elephants, of pachyderms, and so you can see that through the years, and this is millions and millions of years ago. Okay, so if you see 34 Maya, that stands for millions of years ago. So millions of years have changed pachyderms, elephants, the ancestral elephants, from these little tiny weird looking things that have this weird little nose to what we know today. So we are descending through time, we're changing based on what we have available to us and what our environment supports. So descent with modification. So Darwin also noticed another really important thing that kind of supported his idea, and that was called artificial selection. And basically, what artificial selection is that humans, we actually change species and how they look based on what we need or what we want. We've modified other species by breeding them together based on what we want in that species. And this includes different plants, it definitely includes animals. I mean, how do you think we got, a chihuahua from a wolf? That we just chose smaller dogs, colors that we liked. So artificial selection is basically evolution that is sped up like drastically by people. Okay, so he noticed artificial selection is basically just a sped up version of what he thought, and humans were causing evolution a lot quicker than it would happen in nature. So, from this and all of his ideas, he described 4 observations from nature and then drew 2 inferences from them. So, his first observation is that members of a population, and hopefully you remember that a population is a group of the same organisms, same species that is able to interbreed with each other. So his first observation was members of a population can vary greatly in their traits. So in this picture, you can see that these are all the same snails, same species, but they look a lot different. They secrete different things, and their shells look different, different colors and patterns. Obviously, all the people on the planet were the same species, Homo sapiens. We obviously look super different. All of our dogs are the same species, Canis familiaris, but they look way different. It's many different breeds. So members of a population of the same species can vary greatly in their traits. So the second observation was that traits are inherited from their parents to their offspring. Well, that makes sense. You look like your mom or your dad or some kind of family member. So traits are inherited from parents to offspring. Third observation is that all of the species are capable of producing more offspring than the environment can support. Now that is important for later. All species can produce more offspring than the environment can support. Okay, so observation number 4. Overproduction leads to competition for food or other resources. So this piece, the competition piece, is really important for his natural selection theory and his evolution theory. And this is because individuals that are best adapted to their environment will survive and reproduce. So the strongest will survive. The ones with the best traits will survive. So from these 4 observations, he inferred 2 things, or he thought about 2 things, 2 parts of his theories. So the first thing that he inferred was that individuals who have traits that give them a higher probability of surviving and reproducing, so having babies, will leave more offspring. Well, that makes sense. If I'm better suited to my environment, if I can run faster to get away from predators, if I can get more food, well, I'm going to live longer and I'm going to have more babies than that other guy over there who isn't as fast or can't live as long because he's lame. So I'm going to have more babies. I'm going to leave more of my genetics there, and my babies are going to be better. And that's basically what it is. And then the second inference is that there is an unequal ability of individuals to survive, okay, and that can lead to accumulation of favorable traits in a population. So, because some organisms are just better than others, their offspring are going to be better, and then it's going to change the population because the ones who are better to the environment are going to have more babies. So, Darwin was also influenced by this guy named Thomas Malthus. And Malthus, basically what he thought was that the human population is going to increase faster than food and other resources can support. So we're kind of still wondering about this, when we're going to reach the maximum capacity or the carrying capacity of the earth for people. There's going to be a point where the earth can't support us anymore, and that's basically what Malthus wrote about. So if some traits that are heritables are, we can pass it along from generation to generation, if they're advantageous, if they're good, these traits will show up more in the population. Well, that makes sense, because if they're good, they're going to show up more, and the people who have the good traits are going to have more babies. And then it will increase the frequency of the individuals in with those adaptations. And then this whole process explains the match between organisms and their environment. So natural selection, one key phrase that everyone always thinks about whenever you think about evolution and natural selection is survival of the fittest. Okay? And basically all survival of the fittest is the individuals that have the best traits for their environment are going to live longer, have more babies, and their babies are going to have that trait. Okay? If you can run the fastest to get away from predators, if you are smart enough to figure out something in your environment that other organisms of your species can't, well, obviously you're going to be a better adapted. If you're better adapted, you're going to live longer and have more babies. Okay, that's all survival of the fittest is. And natural selection, this is like our third time mentioning it, so you better know what it is. Natural selection increases the adaptation of organisms to their environment over time, so adapting to your environment. And then these two things cause speciation, and this is when all speciation is just new species arising from these adaptations to their environment. Okay, so this guy, John Endler, studied guppies. And guppies are just little tiny fish. There are wild guppies. They didn't just magically appear in a pet store, but he worked with wild guppies. And what he saw was that brightly colored males are more attractive to females. That's usually how it is in most organisms, especially fish. The males are more attractive. But the thing in that population is if they're more brightly colored, they're more vulnerable to getting eaten, to being preyed upon. So the guppy populations in the wild pools and the natural pools with fewer predators had more brightly colored males. Well, that makes sense. If there's nothing there to eat the bright males, there's going to be more bright males because they're going to breed, and then their babies are going to be brightly colored, and there's nothing there to eat them. So this is just a picture of the experiment. Pools that did have predators, however, they had less of the brightly colored males because obviously they were being eaten. So what he did was he transferred brightly colored guppies from the pools with few predators to a pool that had a whole bunch of predators. And then over time, the population became less brightly colored. And that is because in the pools that had the predator fish, the killfish, it was more advantageous to be dull, to be drab colored. Because if you're super bright, then obviously the predator's going to be like, oh, hey, look, ding, there's the brighter color guy over there. I'm going to go eat him. So in those pools, it was more advantageous to be dull. But in the pools of guppies where there were no predators, it was more advantageous to be brightly colored because the females would want to mate with them and have more babies. So the population changed based on their environment and based on what predators were in the pools. So another example of natural selection that we can see is drug-resistant HIV. So HIV We all know what HIV is, and it's basically just a virus that attacks our immune system, and especially if it turns into AIDS. But using drugs to combat HIV has actually made them resistant. So HIV is very, very smart, as smart as viruses can be, and it changes all the time. And HIV actually uses enzymes to make changes to its genome, to its genes. And what is really interesting is that we keep giving these drugs and new drugs to HIV, and they actually change their DNA so that the drugs don't work anymore. The antiviral pills don't work anymore. So that's why there's always new drug cocktails. That's why people that have more money live longer with this disease, because they can afford the new drugs, and then they can get the newest strain or the newest drugs of antivirals and then combat their disease. So, this ability of bacteria and viruses to evolve is kind of rough for people, because as our diseases are getting smarter and smarter and our bacteria and viruses are becoming more drug resistant, we're going to have less options as far as fighting these diseases. So that's a little bit scary. So in this case, well, in every case, natural selection doesn't really create brand new traits. It just changes the ones that are already there. And then the environment determines which traits will be selected for or selected against. So these diseases are changing based on what humans are doing. All they're trying to do is live and make more bacteria and make more viruses. Well, we're the ones introducing all these medications, and they're changing so that they can move on and live. So, this is just another example of fossil evidence and how we can see that it changed over time. We're going to get to talking about some evidence for evolution. So, you can see that the deeper we go, the older it is, and you guys can kind of see that these are related to each other just by the way they look, but they are definitely changing over time. So paleontology, we talked about Cuvier and how Charles Darwin used fossils to kind of shape his ideas and fill in the blanks. So this is just an example of whale ancestors. What was really cool is that whale ancestors actually had legs, and so these are some fossils that were found that kind of led us to believe or led us to the timeline of whales. So now we're going to start talking about different evidences for evolution. And then one thing that we always talk about when we talk about evolution is homology. And homology is basically similarities in different organisms in their structures resulting from having a common ancestor. Homologous structures are parts of our bodies that basically are really similar to each other, even though there are some variations because we had a common ancestor. So this is a very famous example and picture that we always show when we talk about homologous structures. So this is a cat, this is a human, cat, whale, and a bat arm. And you can see that we all have the same structures even though they look different. So here's a humerus bone of a person and the cat, whale, and the bat. Well, obviously they look different, but they are there. Same with the radius, ulna, carpals, phalanges, and metacarpals. They're all there. They just look different. I mean, this hand of a bat looks like our hands if you stretched it out. So at some point, this is evidence that we all had a common ancestor that had these structures. Well, obviously it was a long, long time ago, But I mean, how could we all have the same structures um, if we didn't have a common ancestor at some point? So another thing that we look at when we look at evidence of evolution is comparative embryology. So looking at embryos of different organisms uh, can show that there are so many similarities. So the younger an embryo is, the closer we related we look. So on the right is a human embryo. On the left is a a chicken embryo, and they look pretty similar. The older the fetuses get, the more different they look, obviously. But the longer they stay looking the same in the womb, the more closely related we are. So you can see that the human embryo, we have a tail, we have these gill slits here, and we just look super, super similar. So another example of evolution, some evidence, are vestigial structures. And what vestigial structures are, basically just things that we have on our bodies and that other organisms have that used to serve a purpose, but we don't use them anymore, so they've become obsolete. So an example of a vestigial structure for us would be our tailbones. We don't have tails anymore, but we still have a tailbone. Our appendix is another example. We used to eat a lot more toxic food, and our appendix actually helped get rid of the toxins in our food, and it's kind of just there now. We really don't need it, and the only thing it really does is just get inflamed and infected, and we need surgery for it. We don't need our appendix, but we used to. And then there are homologies or similarities at the molecular level that show that genes are actually shared between organisms. So a lot of us have the same genes. So Darwin looked at the homologies, the similarities of organisms, and kind of created this thing called the evolutionary tree of life. And evolutionary trees are basically just guesses about how different groups of organisms are related and how they changed over time. Evolutionary trees can be made using the different types of data. So we can use fossils to make evolutionary trees. Sometimes they can do DNA sequencing just to see how organisms are related to each other. So this is kind of an example of an evolutionary tree about how we think that these organisms evolved over time, their common ancestors, based on structures that they have similar. Okay, so there is another idea in evolution called convergent evolution, and this is basically the evolution or the change in a species of similar or analogous features, but in groups that are more distantly related. Okay, so analogous traits arise when groups basically adapt to their environment, even though they're not related in similar ways. So, homologous structures are organisms that are related, so they have the same things. Analogous structures are structures that are the same because they just randomly adapted the same to their environment. So an example would be the sugar glider and the flying squirrel. So sugar gliders are super cute. You should Google them if you don't know what they are. But these two guys couldn't be farther apart. And sugar gliders and flying squirrels both have really similar analogous structures in that they can glide from tree to tree, and they were thought to have evolved these structures based on the need to get away from predators and that thing, even though they weren't together. So Darwin also looked at the geography of species. So this is called biogeography. And when he looked at this, it was an important part of his theory of evolution. So obviously he looked at the species, but he looked at the geography of where they were located. Um, so islands have what we call endemic species, and that means that there are species on the islands that don't happen anywhere else. And Darwin guessed that endemic species were closely related to the species on the nearest mainland or island to it. Well, that kind of makes sense. At some point, islands were probably closer together or attached to the mainland, so the endemic species, the species that are only found on that island, would be related to the islands or the land closest to it. And this thought process was from Pangea. Hopefully, we all know what Pangea is. But basically, Pangea is just the Earth was thought to have been all one giant landmass. So if you look at the Earth, and you can kind of see that it fits together like a puzzle, and we thought that all of the Earth was just one huge mass of land surrounded by water, but has separated from continental drift, from different earthquakes and stuff shifting, and all of that kind of stuff. Um, so that would explain why species are similar on the different continents. But understanding that the continents moved, and how the distribution of these species uh, were caused by this, and why we have penguins on the south, in the South Pole and in the Arctic and all of that, that explains why different groups evolved, even though they were so far away to be so similar. So, we are at the end of the chapter. You should be able to describe all of the scientists and what they did: Linnaeus, Cuvier, Lyell, Lamarck, Malthus, and Wallace, how they were important to Darwin's theories, explain Lamarck's theories, what descent with modification is, all of Darwin's observations and what he inferred from them, and then explain why individual organisms can't evolve, that it's populations, not individuals, and then describe evidence for evolution. So, if you have any questions, please make sure that you email me or watch the video again. Please make sure that you are doing your chapter summaries, and I will post any extra information that I think you need.